up. He escaped to Texas on horseback. He gets on a horse and rides to Texas. Where else? And he's hoping there to find a Confederate force that had not surrendered, like rally the troops. One more fight.
It's like that Japanese guy that was on the islands until the 70s.
Yeah, it's just, come on, Jubal, are you serious? We got to remember, this is a guy that voted against secession, but man, he really got it on board with it, didn't he? So, I'm sorry, this just tickles me. I don't know if we need to redo this. But Early proceeded to Mexico, and from there he sailed to Cuba and finally to Canada. You talk about it. Anyway, despite his former Unionist stance, he had been a Unionist at one point, but not anymore. Early declared himself unable to live under the same government as the Yankees. For the rest of his life, he prided himself as an unreconstructed Southerner. That may be where that term originated from. I don't know if he coined it or not, but he was the epitome of that. General Early became a leading proponent of the lost cause myth. Again, more on that later. And he savagely attacked James Longstreet in his writings. He and Longstreet had this war of words that went on for years and years and years. And he also, by the way, I don't have this in the notes, but he worked for the Louisiana Lottery alongside General Beauregard. And Professor Gallagher, who I've mentioned a couple times, he actually wrote a biography of Jubal Early, and he notes that Early understood the struggle to control public memory of the war, and that and I'm going to quote Professor Gallagher, that Jubal Early worked hard to help shape that memory and ultimately enjoyed more success than he probably imagined possible. So General Early and the other Confederates, they lost the war, but they won the PR war afterward, at least for several decades, until really in our lives, Scott. He dies after a fall in 1894 at the age of 77.
Right. And again, that phrase, history is written by the winners, that's not true. I don't know where this comes from. I mean, history is written by the people who write it. And Southerners took care to write the early drafts, and they became codified, and that's what it was. So again, I mean, if you talk about the fight between the Ottomans and the Serbians of 1389, who's going to have a stronger opinion of that today, a Serbian or a Turk? Serbians lost, but you lived there, so I would imagine you met many Serbians who act like it happened yesterday.
Oh, absolutely. You can't sit down with a group of Serbs over coffee, and you can't go 5 minutes without somebody bringing up Kosovo.
Right, and for a Turk,
600 years ago,
they'd shrug their shoulders, and they'd a Turk today would think about it as much as the Battle of Agincourt. He's like, what year was that? Okay, sure, whatever. But and one last thing I want to mention with Early, he didn't do this directly, but James talks about how he hops around to different countries. One of my favorite post-Civil War stories is there's a group called the Confederados. About 10 to 20,000 Confederate American refugees go to Brazil, and they actually set up a city. I think it's called Americana, that's it. It's in the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo. It's still there today. You can still see buildings done up in the antebellum style. And they go to Brazil because slavery is legal there till the 1880s. So many go because they want to continue being involved in an economy that has slavery. Some simply don't want to live in America. They don't feel it's part of their homeland. And now, for one or two generations, the culture somewhat remains intact, but by the third generation, as happens everywhere, the children of the Confederacy marry into Brazilian society. They speak Portuguese, but there's still a festival that happens there once a year where people dress up in Southern regalia. They wear Confederate uniforms. They wave the Confederate flag. It doesn't mean a racist symbol down there in Brazil. It's just a funny little antique from your forefathers. But yeah, so the waves of the Confederacy crash on distant shores far after the conclusion of the Civil War. So a little bit with Jubal Early there. But yeah, his story is interesting enough that it pays to mention that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about our beloved General McClellan. So he bungles his way through the early parts of the war. After the 1864 election, he flat out resigns from the Army. After the war, he goes abroad for 3 years, probably traveling as quickly as he does leading the Army. He returned to the U.S. He works in several engineering and business jobs until he's elected governor of New Jersey in 1878. He retires, or he serves a single term as governor, then retires. He devotes the rest of his life to writing his memoirs. Then he dies in 1885 at the age of 58.
All right, moving on to an equally unsuccessful Confederate general, Braxton Bragg. And I got to repeat the story. This is something my TA in my Civil War classes that I took as an undergrad. He said the Confederacy lost the Civil War in 1848 when, during the Mexican War, a shell landed in Braxton Bragg's tent and did not explode. So, although I actually, just the other day on YouTube, I saw a video that said Braxton Bragg was not that bad. So I'll have to watch that and see what the argument is. But Bragg, of course, was the general who couldn't get along with any of his subordinates, but Jefferson Davis loved him. He lost pretty much every battle that he was involved with in the West. But anyway, Bragg served in a variety of positions, like many of his colleagues, in the insurance and the railroad industries. But he had a hard time keeping a job, surprise, surprise, due to his quarrelsome nature. He just couldn't ever get along with anyone. And to be fair to Bragg, I did mention this several episodes back, that he had a lot of physical issues that probably contributed to his irritability, but still. And Bragg died of heart disease in 1876 at the age of 59.
I got to say, I love reading these biographies because today, if you're a general who retires, you have so many military and political connections. You could just serve on the board of Boeing and do really nothing, but still take home $100,000 to $200,000 a year, and life is cushy. You have your golf course, and you go
make speeches.
Yeah, you make speeches at corporate events, but back then they had to scrabble just as hard as they did before the war in some cases.
Yeah, and especially Confederates.
Yeah, I mean, with your economy in ruins, then there's not much else you can do. One other thing, too, I have to say, it's a rich time to be a historian of the Civil War, all this revisionist history going around. I'd imagine 50 years ago, if you were in the South, being a historian wasn't so much history, but reciting the Holy Catechism of the story of the South and repeating these facts. But yeah, all this interesting stuff happening. Okay, so the next down the list is Ambrose Burnside, our facial hair aficionado, who, if nothing else, bequeaths to us a legacy of having the brilliant mutton chops seen on lesser figures like Chester A. Arthur, but epitomized to perfection by Ambrose Burnside. So in 1866, he's elected governor of Rhode Island and serves from 1866 to 1869. He's a leader in veterans associations and became the first president of the National Rifle Association in 1871, well before Charlton Heston and other figures. So then he's elected to the U.S. Senate in 1874 and serves until his death in 1881 at the age of 57.
It's interesting that so many of these people live such shorter lives. Today the average life expectancy is probably late 70s for men, maybe 80-ish for women. Not surprising considering how bad medicine was back then, but also a lot of these guys carried around war wounds the rest of their lives. Yeah,
and it seems like they were leading armies or generals as young men, as in their 30s or 40s. Not something you would see today. Some of them were, yeah.
Speaking of that, let's talk about John Bell Hood. I have to tell a funny story. Fort Hood which is in Texas. It's a big U.S. Army installation. Fort Hood is named after him. And one time, a long time ago, like probably in the 90s or so, I asked my wife, "Hey, do you know who Fort Hood is named after?" And she looked at me and she said, "The famous General Hood." And I was like, "Wow, that's impressive. How did you know that?" And then I realized, wait a minute, you just said that. You just said whoever. She didn't know who John Bell Hood was, but anyway, that was cute. But Hood was in his 30s when he was a general in the Confederate Army. And of course, we saw he was very unsuccessful. He was essentially responsible for the loss of Atlanta and for the complete loss of almost near annihilation of an entire Confederate army at the battles of Franklin and Nashville. But after the war, Hood moved to Louisiana and he worked in the cotton and insurance businesses. He and his wife, tragically, they died in New Orleans in a yellow fever epidemic in 1879 at the age of he was 48. That's it. That's younger than I am right now. And they left 10 orphan children.
Wow.
His fellow Confederate General Beauregard, who we mentioned earlier, he very nicely and kindly saw that Hood's memoirs were published so that the proceeds could support the children. So that's it for Hood.
Right. Next is Joseph Hooker. After the war, he led Lincoln's funeral procession in Springfield on May 4th, 1865. Later, he commanded the Department of the East and Department of the Lakes. He had poor health after the war and was partially paralyzed by a stroke. He retires from the Army in 1868 and dies in 1879 at the age of 64. Again, not terribly old.
All right, moving to the Confederate side, now we get to look at the Beast.
Oh.
Nathan Bedford Forrest. That was not his nickname. That's what.
Wizard of the Saddle.
Yeah, the Wizard of the Saddle. That was his nickname at the time. I used to play the Civil War board game, just called the Civil War, and it was super detailed and had a 56-page rule book, and it would take 12, 15 hours to play. You know, back when I was young and had time to do that. And they have each of the generals has their own marker, and I was playing a friend, and Forrest had really good. He was really good in the game as he was in the real war. And my friend said, "Man, Forrest is a beast." So I always think of him as the Beast. So in 1867, as almost every American knows, Forrest, or at least history buff, Forrest became the first imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. But he later quit when the Klan became too violent for even him. And he was not a peaceful man by any stretch of the imagination. We saw one time when he was confronted by General Bragg. He basically threatened Bragg, "Don't mess with me again or I'm going to kill you." Unlike many former Confederates, Forrest spoke in encouragement of black advancement and of endeavoring to be a proponent for espousing peace and harmony between black and white Americans going forward. You would not expect that from Forrest, would you? But anyway, he died from acute complications of diabetes in Memphis in 1877 at the age of 56.
Yeah, and one interesting thing with Forrest, I talked with an author who wrote a book on him, and there's an interesting parallel with Forrest and former Governor George Wallace, who famously prevented students from, what was it? I forget the year. He was a governor of Alabama. I don't want to mess it or have a slip of the mind, but in the period of the civil rights movement, Wallace is really
George Wallace, Governor George Wallace.
Governor George Wallace. He's really a villain of the civil rights movement for good reason. Right. But what most don't know about Wallace, and Nathan Bedford Forrest shares this, is later in life, both had a religious awakening. And by the end of Wallace's life, he's governor of Alabama up into the 1980s. And he has a religious conversion experience and then renounces his racist ways. There's pictures of him you can find. He meets with civil rights leaders. He meets with Jesse Jackson. He apologizes for all the things he did. And I don't know if Forrest goes quite that far, but he does have sort of a change of heart where at the end of his life, he's far more sympathetic than you would expect him to be based on his earlier actions.
Definitely that, and he was definitely out in front of the times, at least in the South.
All right. Well, okay. So moving on down. We have George Meade. So Meade's commissioner of Fairmount Park in Philadelphia from 1866 until his death. He also held various military commands, including the Military Division of the Atlantic, the Department of the East, and the Department of the South. He replaces Major General John Pope as governor of the Reconstruction 3rd Military District in Atlanta in 1868. Meade receives an honorary doctorate in law from Harvard, and he has numerous scientific achievements, including inventing a hydraulic lamp for use in a lighthouse. He's recognized by many institutions, including the American Philosophical Society and the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences. But like many other veterans, he continues to suffer from health complications from war wounds, and he dies in 1872 at the age of 56 following a battle with pneumonia. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.